What happens when a man sworn to protect the forest is left chained to a tree by the very people who should have had his back? Raymond Ellis wasn't supposed to survive. 2 days in the snow, no food, no backup, no explanation. But something found him. Not a rescue team, not a ranger, a dog, a retired K9 once thought too old to serve, followed a trail no one else saw. What happened next would expose a web of betrayal reaching straight into the badge itself. This isn't just a story about survival, it's about loyalty in the face of silence, corruption hiding behind routine, and the quiet kind of courage that doesn't ask to be noticed, just refuses to look away. Let me show you what really happened in Pine Ridge, and why sometimes the ones we overlook are the ones who end up saving everything. The woods didn't make a sound that morning. No birds, no wind, just the thick blanket of snow swallowing every trace of movement. To most, it was another quiet Tuesday in the northern stretch of Pine Ridge County. But beneath one crooked pine, chained to its base with wrists scraped raw and eyes half closed, lay a man who should have been long gone. Raymond Ellis had been missing for 2 days. A senior forest ranger with 30 years of service, he'd vanished without alert, without a call for backup, and without a trace, until now. His uniform was torn, one boot missing, blood crusted around his mouth, and the chains bit so deeply into his wrists that skin had fused to iron. He wasn't dead. Not yet. But no one was supposed to find him, except someone did. Or rather, something. The first to reach him was a large German shepherd with a mottled black coat and steady, alert eyes. Shadow had once served overseas, trained for missions no one ever spoke about. Now retired, he had joined the local K9 training unit, mostly to stay active, mostly to feel useful. That morning, during a routine drill in the nearby hills, Shadow broke formation. The others followed. 3 dogs veering off from their handler's path, chasing something only they could sense. They found Raymond not because they were ordered to, but because loyalty sometimes doesn't wait for permission. Shadow didn't bark. He didn't panic. He simply circled the tree, sniffed the air, then nudged Raymond's limp shoulder with his nose, once, twice, then again, until the man's eyelid twitched. It was enough. The rest of the unit arrived minutes later. The scene stopped them cold. The young officer in charge, barely 6 months into her post, couldn't speak. One of the dogs whimpered. Another sat down and refused to move. And Shadow stood guard. He didn't leave Raymond's side. Not even when the EMTs arrived with stretchers and oxygen. When the paramedics tried to lift the ranger, Shadow growled, low, defensive, protective. He knew something the rest didn't. He'd seen eyes like Raymond's before, eyes that had stared too long into a place no man should ever be left alone. To the officers it looked like a miracle, but for Shadow it was instinct. For Raymond, it was the last thread of grace in a system that had failed him. No one could explain how the dogs knew. There were no scents, no tracks, no reason to veer off course. But as they lifted Raymond onto the stretcher and Shadow followed close behind, one truth became clear. Sometimes the ones we think need saving are the ones who end up saving us. And sometimes loyalty isn't something we earn. It's something that finds us when we need it most. Next, what Shadow did next at the infirmary shocked even his longtime handler. Back at the base, the air was still heavy. The radio crackled with quiet dispatches, but no one said much. Raymond Ellis had been flown out by medevac, unconscious but alive. The snow-covered path that led to his discovery was already being taped off as a potential crime scene. And yet, for all the protocol, one detail refused to sit right with the team. How had the dogs known? Sarah Kincaid, head trainer of the Echo K9 unit, stood with her arms folded, watching the footage from the helmet cam. The dogs had changed direction at nearly the same moment. No verbal command, no signal, just a sudden pivot to the east. That pivot, precisely 93 seconds later, had led them to the tree. She replayed the moment again. This time, she watched only Shadow. He had stopped in his tracks, his ears twitched, body stiff, nose lifted toward the cold air. Then he moved, not hesitantly, not randomly, with purpose. Sarah leaned back. She'd seen this dog move through rubble and Mosul. She'd seen him detect explosives buried beneath 4 feet of rock. But this was something else. No scent, no signal, just a gut feeling, a decision, a choice. And she realized something. Shadow hadn't broken protocol, he'd overridden it. Meanwhile, across the county, the first responders at St. Helens Infirmary had never seen anything like what happened next. As the nurses wheeled Raymond into emergency care, Shadow refused to leave the lobby. Twice they tried to lead him out. Twice he sat, unmoving, eyes fixed on the hallway. Eventually, one of the nurses, an older woman named Lillian, walked over, crouched beside him, and whispered something no one could quite hear. Then she gently placed her hand on his head. He blinked slowly, then rose, and followed her through the swinging doors. They made an exception for him that day. No one questioned it. Shadow padded softly into the recovery room, curled up beside the hospital bed, and lowered his head to the floor. Raymond hadn't woken yet. The monitors beeped steadily, a slow reminder that breath was still there, however faint. But Shadow didn't need confirmation. He simply stayed. 1 hour passed, and just as the sky outside turned from gray to gold, Raymond stirred. His fingers twitched. A cough rattled from his chest, and his eyes, bloodshot and dazed, fluttered open. The first thing he saw was not a doctor, not a nurse, not even the room. It was a dog, quiet, still, watching. In that moment he didn't remember the tree, the cold, the chains. He remembered warmth and the eyes of something that hadn't left. No words were spoken, none were needed. Because sometimes the only thing more powerful than the right voice is the right silence. By the second day, Raymond could finally sit up. The IV in his arm stung each time he shifted, and his throat felt like gravel from days without water. But when the nurse offered to draw the curtain and give him privacy, he shook his head gently. "I'm not alone," he whispered. At the foot of the bed, Shadow lay curled, eyes half closed but alert. Not once had he left the room, not even when food was offered. The hospital staff had tried to rotate him out, suggested Sarah take him back to the K9 unit. But each time they tried, the dog would plant himself in the doorway, immovable, unreadable, determined. And something about that, about the quiet loyalty, settled deep in Raymond's chest, in a place no one had reached in years. He had always been a solitary man. Divorced at 40, no children, lived in a modest cabin 2 miles from the ranger station. He'd made peace with silence long ago. But this wasn't silence. It was presence. The kind that doesn't ask questions or offer comfort. It just stays. Sarah Kincaid stood outside the room, watching through the glass. She'd never seen Shadow this way. For years he'd been disciplined, aloof, brilliant in drills, unmatched in detection, but cold when it came to people. Even with her, he kept a respectful distance. Always alert, always waiting, but never reaching. Now, watching the way he watched Raymond, it was like watching an old soldier recognize another. Later that afternoon, Sarah stepped inside quietly. Raymond turned his head slowly, his voice still raspy. "He yours?" She smiled faintly. "Was, until about 2 days ago." Raymond didn't laugh, but he nodded. "I owe him," he said. Sarah pulled a chair closer, sat down. "You remember anything about what happened?" There was a long pause, then he nodded once. "It wasn't random," he said. "They knew where I'd be, knew I'd be alone." He didn't elaborate, and she didn't press. Instead, they sat in the dim hospital light. One man, one dog, and the woman trying to make sense of it all. Outside, snow began to fall again, soft and slow against the window pane. And for the first time since waking up, Raymond reached out, not to shake a hand, not to call for help, but to rest his palm on Shadow's head. It wasn't a gesture of thanks, it was something quieter than that, recognition. In another place, they might have passed without a word. But here, in this small room filled with silence and snow, something unspoken had already been decided. Raymond Ellis was no longer alone, and Shadow, retired, written off, overlooked, had found a mission no one had assigned him. The storm had passed, but the snow hadn't melted. At the ambush site, everything was quiet, too quiet. The pine needles, stiff and brittle under ice, snapped softly beneath each bootstep. A forensics team marked the area with small orange flags. Sheriff Alan Reese stood just outside the perimeter, arms crossed, brow low, like a man trying to look concerned but hiding something deeper. Raymond Ellis had asked to return, just for a few minutes. He needed to see it. Sarah drove him up slowly, letting him take in the silence. Shadow sat in the back seat, ears high, nose pressed against the cracked window. When they arrived, Raymond didn't speak. He simply stepped out, moving carefully on his still stiff legs, and walked the few feet toward the tree. It was still there. The chain, too. Someone had tried to bag it as evidence, but the bark bore the marks. deep scars gouged by steel links and frost-bitten wrists. He looked down. Snow had partially covered the tire tracks, but not enough to hide them. A distinct tread. 4 wheels. No chains. Likely a contractor-grade pickup. Raymond knelt, his eyes scanning the pattern. "Those weren't from any ranger vehicle," he said quietly. Sarah nodded. "We checked. Doesn't match anything in the fleet." Raymond turned to Sheriff Reese. "You said the logbook showed no entries for the past 3 days. No authorized visits to the North Fire Line." "That's right," Reese replied quickly. "No sign-ins. Whoever did this bypassed the gate completely." Raymond looked at him, steady and long. "No one gets up here without the gate code. That's protocol. Always has been." The sheriff shifted his weight. "Maybe they forced it." "No," Raymond said. "They didn't break the lock. They used it. Which means someone gave them access." Behind them, Shadow began to growl, low and steady. Sarah placed a hand gently on his back, but the dog's eyes didn't move from the sheriff. Raymond stood slowly. "I'm telling you, this wasn't just a hit and run. Someone wanted me gone, and they knew my route, my schedule, even that I'd be working alone that day." He paused, "which means they either guessed right or someone told them." Reese held his ground, but Sarah saw it, that split-second flicker in his eyes. Not guilt, not fear, just calculation. She stepped forward. "We need access to your department's visitor logs, and we'd like to speak to your contractors." Reese smiled, thin and professional. "Of course, I'll have my office send it over." Raymond watched him walk away. "He's hiding something," he said. "I don't know what yet, but it's there." Sarah didn't respond. She didn't have to. Some truths aren't spoken. They're felt, like cold through your boots or the weight of someone watching you too long after the conversation's ended. Back in the truck, Raymond sat with Shadow resting his head on his thigh. He looked out the window, toward the tree that nearly became his grave. "They think I'm still out of the game," he said softly. "They think I'm staying quiet." Then he looked down at Shadow. "But they're wrong. The cabin was never meant to be a fortress. Just a ranger's rest stop, tucked in a clearing, 30 miles from the nearest town and even farther from help. The kind of place where nothing ever happened, until something did." It was after midnight when Raymond heard it. A soft crunch. Then another. Too deliberate to be an animal. Too slow to be a mistake. He reached for the flashlight first, then the old .38 he kept inside the drawer, more habit than hope. Shadow, already awake, stood at the door, ears forward, body rigid, no sound from his throat. Not even a growl. Raymond opened the front door a sliver. The cold hit instantly, but so did the truth. No headlights, no engine, just 3 dark shapes moving through the trees. He didn't wait. He hit the emergency beacon, a signal built into the radio tower behind the cabin. It would take at least 20 minutes for help to arrive. Maybe more. Then he locked the front door, turned to Shadow, and said what neither of them needed to hear. "They're not here to talk." The first shot came through the back window. Glass exploded into the sink. Raymond ducked low, pulling the table down for cover. Shadow darted behind the wood stove, waiting for the next move. Another shot. Closer this time. They were surrounding the house. From the crawl space beneath the floorboards, Raymond retrieved the old service shotgun he hadn't touched in years. The metal was cold, heavier than he remembered, but it didn't shake in his hands. Outside, one of the men crept toward the back. Shadow moved first. He slipped through the half-open side door, circled around the shed, and in one sudden leap, tackled the intruder to the ground. The man screamed once before Shadow's jaw clamped down hard, controlled but final. He didn't kill. He just stopped him cold. The other 2 heard the commotion. Raymond stepped into the moonlight then, barrel raised, voice clear. "Drop it." One did. The other hesitated. That was his mistake. A second later, the night lit up with red and blue. 2 sheriff deputies swerved into the clearing, followed by Sarah's unit, sirens off, guns drawn. The standoff ended in less than a minute. 3 men on the ground, 1 dog, silent and watchful. Raymond didn't speak. He didn't have to. Sarah stepped toward the man Shadow had taken down. She recognized him immediately. "Derek Barnes," she said. "Used to work highway maintenance. Contracted under the fire prevention grant." Raymond turned. "That program was suspended 6 months ago." Sarah nodded, and Sheriff Reese was the one who signed off the final paperwork. No one spoke for a while. The wind picked up, scattering loose snow across the gravel. Shadow limped slightly as he returned to Raymond's side. Not from injury, just from exhaustion. Raymond knelt beside him, his hand brushing the thick fur behind Shadow's ear. "You did good, partner." And in that quiet, broken cabin, full of glass, smoke, and something close to justice, they stood together. Not because they were ready for what came next, but because now they knew who they were up against. The next morning, everything looked normal on the surface. A fresh pot of coffee brewed in the corner of the sheriff's station. The blinds were drawn halfway. A deputy scribbled down parking citations like any other Tuesday. But beneath it all, something had shifted. Sarah sat at her desk, sifting through contractor files from the past year. Dozens of names, sign-in logs, authorization codes. Most of them lined up, but 3 entries didn't. One was Derek Barnes, the man Shadow had taken down. The other 2 were aliases, false identities tied to contractor badges that shouldn't have existed. More importantly, all 3 had been cleared by the same signature, Sheriff Alan Reese. Raymond stood behind her, arms crossed, his face unreadable. "Tell me this isn't what I think it is," he said quietly. Sarah didn't answer. Instead, she opened another drawer and pulled out a folded sheet, a map of the Pine Ridge boundary. A red marker had drawn a new access road, one that cut straight through a protected zone. "That path was never approved," she said. "But it's there, and someone used it." Raymond leaned closer. "To move what?" Sarah looked at him. Then to the wall, where a photo of the sheriff hung above the oath of office. "That's the part I'm afraid to find out." Elsewhere in the records room, a junior deputy named Wesley, a sharp kid just out of academy, came across something even more damning. A permit log. Dozens of environmental clearances with forged state stamps. Most were minor. Tree removal, fire breaks, but a few were for structures. Foundations. Foundations in places where building had long been outlawed due to erosion risk, and every single one had been signed off with the same initials. A.R. Wesley brought the file to Sarah. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. She opened it slowly, flipping through the pages. The scope was bigger than they thought. This wasn't about a single ranger left in the woods. This was a cover-up tied to money, contracts funneled through shell companies, land being cleared illegally under the guise of public work. Raymond paced the room. "That tree I was chained to," he said. "I know why they picked it. It's the edge of that parcel." Sarah nodded. "You were the last inspection officer left on that side of the district. If you filed a report, the permits wouldn't hold." Raymond's voice dropped. "They weren't trying to kill me right away, just long enough to delay the paper trail." Outside the window, the sun caught the badge on Deputy Wesley's chest. He looked down, like it burned. "I joined this job because of men like you," he said to Raymond. "And now I've got to ask, how many more Reese types are still wearing the same badge?" Raymond didn't answer. He couldn't. But Shadow, sitting in the corner, lifted his head. His ears twitched toward the hallway. A door creaked. Footsteps approached, and in the silence before the next storm, the truth was clear. Sometimes the danger isn't outside the station. Sometimes it wears a badge and a smile. The confrontation didn't happen in a courtroom. It didn't need a jury or a judge. Just one hallway, 2 men, and the truth that had been circling them for far too long. Raymond waited outside Sheriff Reese's office, file in hand. The papers were cold, crisp, and damning. Behind the door, he could hear Reese talking, casual, unhurried. A conversation about scheduling patrol shifts, as if nothing had happened. As if he hadn't signed off on land theft or watched a man nearly die under orders he helped protect. Sarah stood beside Raymond, quiet but firm. Behind them, Deputy Wesley tightened his grip on the camera he'd used to record the confession. Audio pulled from a phone call intercepted the night before. Reese didn't know they had it. Not yet. The door opened. Reese looked up from his desk, blinking once. "Ray," he said, smiling. "Didn't expect you back so soon." Raymond didn't answer. He stepped inside, laid the file down on the desk, and pressed the recorder. Reese's voice played clearly. "I'm not the one who chained him. I just looked the other way. You know how much that land is worth once it's cleared? Hell, the contracts were done before he even knew what was coming." The room went still. Reese reached for the folder, but Sarah stepped forward. "Don't," she said. Wesley stood in the doorway now, hand resting near his belt, not on his weapon, but close enough to make the message clear. This wasn't a discussion. Reese leaned back slowly. "You gonna arrest me?" he asked, voice thin. Raymond looked at him, the way only a man betrayed by a friend can look. There was no rage, just something colder, something final. "I trusted you. When I trained rookies, I told them this badge meant something, that it stood for the people who can't fight back. You've turned it into a business card." Reese's jaw tightened. "Careful what you're accusing me of," he said. But it was too late. Sarah pulled the warrant from her jacket. "Alan Reese, you are under arrest for obstruction of justice, conspiracy to defraud the state, and attempted homicide by omission." She didn't shout. She didn't raise her voice. She just said it clearly, so there would be no confusion, no way to twist it later. Reese stood slowly, hands clenched. "You're making a mistake." Shadow entered the room then. He didn't bark, didn't bare his teeth. He simply walked to Raymond's side and sat, gaze locked on Reese. The sheriff looked down at the dog. "You trained it to hate me?" Raymond shook his head. "He doesn't hate you. He just sees you now, for what you are." Wesley stepped forward and clicked the cuffs shut. The sound echoed louder than anyone expected. Out in the main room, every deputy had stopped moving. Paperwork paused, coffee cups left midair. No one said a word. As Reese was led out, one older deputy whispered, "About damn time." The silence that followed wasn't heavy, it was clean. Like something had finally been lifted off the air. And in the stillness, Raymond stood taller, not in victory, but in clarity. Because justice isn't always loud. Sometimes it's just a quiet man doing what no one else had the courage to finish. It should have been over. With Sheriff Reese in custody and the investigation opened, the station had quieted. Not in fear, but in relief. Files were being audited, contracts frozen, deputies whispered less, walked steadier. For the first time in months, maybe years, there was a feeling that truth might actually hold. But Raymond knew better. Corruption rarely walks alone. That morning, Sarah, Raymond, and Deputy Wesley met in the briefing room. Sarah was preparing to transfer Shadow's care permanently to Raymond. The paperwork was simple. The meaning wasn't. "You sure about this?" she asked. "He's not a pet." Raymond nodded. "Neither am I." They both smiled, tired but real. Then the back door slammed. It wasn't loud, just wrong. The kind of sound that doesn't belong in a quiet room. Raymond turned first, then Shadow. Deputy Cole Tanner stood in the hallway. Not in uniform, not in a stance of control, just standing, pale. Jaw tight, one hand behind his back. Wesley stepped forward. "Cole, you're not scheduled today." Tanner's voice came out low, flat. He wasn't supposed to bring the dog into this. No one moved. "What are you talking about?" Sarah asked. Tanner's hand came forward fast. A pistol. Unregistered, already cocked. Shadow moved before anyone else could. The shot rang out across the walls, sharp and final. It hit Shadow square in the side. The dog yelped once, short, high, and unbearably human. Raymond lunged, driving Tanner back against the lockers. Wesley followed, disarming him, slamming the man down with more fury than training. Sarah dropped to her knees. Shadow lay on the cold floor, legs twitching, blood pooling around him in widening arcs. Raymond crouched beside him, his hands pressing against the wound, voice cracking with words he hadn't used in years. "Stay with me. Don't you dare go." Shadow's eyes fluttered, not panicked, not pained, just tired. Sarah called for an emergency evac. Her voice didn't shake, but her hands did. Tanner was cuffed, pinned, dragged out of the hallway. On the way out, he spat the words that burned through the silence. "You were just supposed to retire, Ray, not dig everything up." No one answered. They were too busy holding on to a life that never asked for recognition, only a chance to serve. At the Animal Trauma Center, they worked for 4 hours. Shadow lost blood. Too much. But he didn't give in. When Raymond walked into recovery that evening, the nurse simply pointed. "He's waiting for you," she said. Inside, Shadow lifted his head, slow and strained. Raymond sat beside him, breathing for the first time that day. "I got you. We're not done yet." Outside the window, the sun dipped behind the hills. Inside, one man and one dog shared a silence stronger than any vow. Because some battles leave scars you carry, and some leave you changed in ways no one else can see. 3 weeks later, the snow had melted. The pine trees stood bare, and the trail leading into the backwoods of Pine Ridge had opened again. Most of the media had left. The story was old news by now, buried under headlines about city budgets, elections, and the next scandal. But to the people who lived here, some things don't fade with the news cycle. Raymond Ellis stood at the edge of the trailhead, a new badge clipped to his vest. He wasn't a ranger anymore. Not officially, but today marked the start of something better. The Echo Canine unit was his now. 3 dogs, 2 handlers, and 1 partner that refused to quit no matter what the odds were. Shadow walked beside him, slower than before, his side still wrapped in light gauze. The wound had healed, but not fully. Some days he limped, some days he didn't, but he always got up and always looked forward. Just like Raymond. Behind them, Sarah Kincaid signed the last release forms, transferring ownership. She didn't cry, but her voice had caught when she said goodbye. "He's not just yours, Ray," she'd said. "He's ours. All of us who ever needed someone to stay when things got hard." Raymond nodded. He understood. He didn't say thank you. He just looked her in the eye, hand resting gently on Shadow's back. And now, as they walked into the clearing, just the 2 of them, there were no ceremonies, no cameras, no awards, only the soft crunch of leaves. The wind catching faint traces of pine in the air, and a silence so complete it felt like peace. They reached the old Firewatch Hill, the same spot where Raymond had once watched over the forest, scanning for smoke, thinking he was alone in what he carried. Now, he wasn't. Shadow sat beside him. Their eyes followed the ridgeline together. Not in search of danger, just watching. A few hikers passed by below. One waved. Raymond nodded back. No one recognized him. No one needed to. Because sometimes the people who do the most don't need to be seen. They just need to be there. In the right place, at the right time, and stay. As the wind picked up, Raymond reached down and whispered something only Shadow heard. A soft word, a promise. The dog looked up, and together they stood. Not in defiance, not in pain, but in quiet triumph. Because justice doesn't always arrive with noise. Sometimes it limps, sometimes it heals, and sometimes it walks beside you. Silent as the trees, strong as the truth, and loyal long after the world forgets. If you've ever felt invisible in the face of power, press 1. If you believe quiet courage still matters, press 2. And if this story stayed with you, share it. Sometimes stories like these don't need to go viral, they just need to be remembered. We tell stories that others overlook. If that matters to you, subscribe. Not for numbers, but so we know who's walking this quiet road with us.